Today I'm going to talk about dealing with the frustrations that come along with fishing in and around submerged vegetation. Now, if you're a bass angler, you know when you find that good, clean, healthy submerged vegetation, that's going to be productive water. The bass are going to be nearby. Here's the rub. When does your day go from having fun catching fish to just pure frustration, doing nothing but hanging up and pulling snot off your baits? We'll talk about everything you need to know to be productive in submerged vegetation. We're going to do that right now. Let's get into it. When you're fishing in and around submerged vegetation, efficiency is going to play a huge factor in either your success or your lack of success. Today I'll be sharing information to help you increase your efficiency. I'll talk about some of my most productive baits, when and why I use them. We'll also talk about some proven techniques. Now here's a tip, and you guys have heard this time and time again, but it is especially important to keep this in the back of your mind when you're fishing challenging conditions. And believe me, fishing in heavy submerged vegetation is a challenging condition. There's no substitute for time on the water. Just getting out, feeling the vegetation, holding it in your hand, pulling baits through it. Just get out, put time on the water. There is no substitute for that. In most cases, your success will not come from pulling baits out of your box. Your success will come from pulling past experiences out of your brain. There's no substitute for time on the water. Let's talk about some baits. I'm going to give you 6 of my favorite baits, and we'll go into more detail on how we rig these and how we use them as we get up on the front of the boat and we talk about the techniques and things. First bait you're going to want is a chatterbait. Next bait, a lipless crankbait. Next bait, and this would be number 3, an unweighted Senko rigged weedless. The 4th bait would be a standard fluke. 5th bait would be what I call a zero gravity jig. We'll get into that in just a minute. And the last bait would be a smaller to mid-size swim baits. I told you that I think efficiency is extremely important when you're fishing around vegetation, and you have to kind of have an idea of what efficiency is. I don't want to spend a lot of time explaining it, so I'm going to be very quick with explaining efficiency, and I want you to keep this in the back of your mind as we go through the rest of the video. We're going to break down a day's fishing into 10 casts. You're around heavy cover, you make 10 casts, and 8 of those casts get hung up in the vegetation. You don't have a very high efficiency rating. You're spending most of your time cleaning baits off. What you're looking for is to figure out the right bait, the right technique, the right boat positioning, where you can cast out and retrieve your bait without it getting hung up, and retrieve it at the proper speed with the proper manipulations of the bait so that you can catch some fish at least 50% of the time. Now, would I like to be 100% efficient on every cast? Yeah, that's not going to happen unless you're fishing in a swimming pool. So just be aware that you're never going to be 100% efficient, but what we want to do is go out, especially when we find fish or we think there's fish in there, we're getting bit, we want to stay in that area because it's a productive area. We want to do things that are going to make our day more productive. We have maybe 3 or 4 casts out of every 10 that we're able to retrieve back to the boat, and we want to stay there. We're going to think about what baits to change. We're going to think about techniques, things of that nature, to maybe bring that productivity or that efficiency up from maybe every 3 or 4 casts that we retrieve and get back to the boat without fouling up, to maybe 5 or 6 casts. You get in that 50 or 60% efficiency range where you're fishing more than pulling snot off your baits, then you can do some damage. Okay, the 3 situations that we normally encounter as fishermen on any given body of water. And today we'll be talking about pulling up to a flat with some submerged vegetation. Situation number 1, and I'll tell you right off the bat, situation number 1 and number 2 we don't care about. We're really going to focus in on situation number 3. The first situation would be you pull up, you start fishing, you're catching fish, you're not hanging up, you're having fun. No questions need to be asked. You stay there, you wear those fish out. When they stop biting, you leave. That's situation number 1. Doesn't happen very often. Situation number 2, the exact opposite. You come up to that same flat, you're not getting bit, you're not catching fish, you're not seeing bait, there's no activity, you're getting hung up a lot. That's the time you make a quick decision and you get the heck out of there. Now, decision number 3, that's what we're going to focus on, and it's kind of a combination between 1 and 2. And when you're in situation number 3, everyone starts second guessing themselves as when to stay, when to go, when to change baits, what to do. Situation number 3, you come out on that same flat. You see some activity, you see some bait, maybe you spot a fish. Maybe you get a bite, but you're getting hung up. At that point, you're frustrated, you don't know whether to stay in the spot and maybe change tactics. You don't know what tactics to change to. You don't know if you should leave, come back later, so on and so forth. That's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to pull up, actually I think I'm going to use this as a demonstration right behind me, and we're going to talk about going through the entire situation of coming up, seeing fish, being frustrated, knowing what baits to use, what techniques to use, when you need to leave, when you need to stay. We're going to get into that right now. So we're fishing down the bank. We're catching a few fish here and there. Maybe we've got a jerk bait on this particular day, and we pull into the situation that we're talking about. We see a nice flat with some nice clean vegetation. We got about 4 or 5 feet of water. We've got a good place to start looking for fish. And as we're coming up on that flat, maybe we spook a nice big 3-4 pound fish and it goes right into the vegetation. As we get up a little closer, we start to see bait. Vegetation looks good. We got bait. We've seen a fish. Maybe we throw out, maybe we get a bite right off the bat. We don't catch it, but we know there's activity here. So what we do is, again, we've been fishing a jerk bait. We make 3, 4, 5 casts out, and what happens is we're not able to fish efficiently. Every time we cast out, we're pulling in some type of vegetation. This is where you ask the question, geez, I got a bite, I know there's fish in here, but it's just getting so frustrating because I'm doing nothing but hanging up. Maybe I should leave. Should you leave? No. You found a good area, you know there's fish here, you've gotten a bite, you just need to start adjusting your techniques and your baits. So what we're going to do is run through a lot of the baits and techniques that we can think about changing to and using to maybe work this. We'll finding a pattern to work this flat that we're on, that we know there's fish, and we're just going to look for how to catch fish on that particular flat. The first thing that I would do if I had gotten a bite on a jerk bait, the first bait I would switch to would be a plain fluke or a super fluke. I would fish this unweighted, and I would use a inline worm hook, so it's totally weedless. I'd throw this on a spinning rod, 7-foot medium action spinning rod with probably 8-pound test. If you're fishing in super clear water in a lake, you might go with 6-pound test. That's a bait that I can throw out and I can work through the vegetation. It's going to sink very slowly. It's going to run right through the tops of the vegetation, and if I allow it to sink and just hold and dead stick it, it's not going to bury itself in the vegetation. So that fluke is a great choice anytime you're fishing submerged vegetation. My second bait would plain and simply be a 5 or 6 inch Senko, and I would throw that unweighted. Once again, probably use an extra wide gap hook, no weight at all. This is another bait that will allow us to pretty much fish through any vegetation that we have out there. With this bait, I'll probably be throwing a 7'2" medium heavy bait casting rod. Out on the Delta, I'm using probably 40-pound braid, 50-pound braid with maybe a 3 or 4 feet of leader, mono leader, 10 to 12, maybe 14-pound test. But this is something, again, that you can throw out, make a long cast, and just slowly retrieve it through the vegetation. If I didn't get bit on that, or maybe I got a fish, maybe it's a smaller fish, I'm looking for bigger fish, we talked about a zero gravity jig. Now, what is a zero gravity jig? If you look them up, you can still buy them on the internet. This is a jig that the head is not made out of lead, it's epoxy. So this jig is very light. Now, why I like fishing these in submerged vegetation like this, they don't sink and go to the bottom. I can fish it over the top of the vegetation, and when I let it work its way down in the vegetation, it's not going to bury itself again. These are great jigs to imitate bluegill, depending on the trailer. Keep it green pumpkin, yellows and oranges, blues. This could be a bluegill imitation, or you can put a trailer on it that would more mimic a crayfish. Then this becomes a crayfish imitation. So it's a good searching bait. And when I am fishing submerged vegetation, the three things that I'm thinking are going to be in there that the fish are feeding on are either bluegill, crayfish, or frogs. So if you stick to those colors on any of these baits, you're going to be doing fine. So we've run through the fluke, unweighted Cinco. We've thrown the zero gravity jig. If you don't have any zero gravity jigs, you can just use a very light jig with maybe an 1/8 ounce head so that it doesn't bury itself in the vegetation. Another thing that I like to use, and I'll just go through this real quick, is a horny toad, the Zoom horny toad, and you could hook this up with a extra wide gap hook, just like this. If you need to have weight on it, you could put a little split shot in front of the weight. And what this does, you can fish this through vegetation just like a crankbait. I like white all the time, but again, when I'm fishing this type of vegetation, I like to have something that may mimic a bluegill or also a crayfish. So, think about the colors that you use. But horny toads are really great in this situation. The next thing that I would probably do, especially if we had some wind out here and you've got maybe some cloud cover, it's a frontal situation coming up, you've got some small, what we call capillary waves that are breaking up the water, and you can throw something a little bigger without disturbing the fish. It would be a lipless crankbait like an LV500 or a rattle trap. These are great because you can allow them to sink down in the vegetation, and you're going to rip them through the vegetation. It'll pull right through and come out fairly clean. You're going to want to use, again, a standard bait casting rod, probably 7'2", medium heavy. I like to go straight braid when I'm fishing through this vegetation because I could rip it, and as this thing rips through, even if it's caught up, it's going to clean itself off. You can either burn this back to the boat, you can yo-yo it back to the boat, but these are great, great baits to fish around submerged vegetation. The other bait that I failed to mention, but is probably the #1 bait and the people's choice, would be plain and simply a chatterbait. I like throwing a jackhammer, and once again, you can, as far as picking your colors, if you see a lot of bluegill, run a bluegill color. If you see a lot of crayfish popping around, or you know the area that you're in has a lot of crayfish, then you're going to use that maybe fire claw color with maybe more of a crayfish trailer on it. One thing that I do stay away from out here is anything with a bill on it, even a square bill or something like that, a crankbait that's going to dig down into the vegetation, because these are just not very efficient baits out here. Last but not least, maybe it's springtime and you see some of these great big monsters just sitting in this vegetation, just waiting for the spawn to come up. Maybe it's pre-spawn, maybe it's post-spawn, maybe they're not out on their beds yet, but they're staging up and they're in an area like this. I love to throw paddle tail swim baits. I got a Mega Bass mag draft here. I love to throw, it could be just baits like this that would represent small crayfish. These fish are hungry. The bigger fish are hungry in the spring. They're coming out. They've kind of went through winter without feeding a whole lot, and before they get into spawn, they're going to be real aggressive and real hungry. I like throwing these things on this is a owner beast hook. You guys know what we're talking about. It's weighted, but with this bait here, you can throw this out and let it get right down in the vegetation because it is so weedless, and you could just work it through the vegetation. You're going to want to throw a medium heavy or maybe even a heavy 50 to 60 pound braid, straight braid, and what you're going to do with these is just make a really long cast, and you're going to just very slowly pop it through the vegetation. Now you have to remember, fish feed differently when they're in heavy vegetation compared to when they are out in open water. The fish in heavy vegetation don't have the ability to see everything, so they're feeding mostly on what they're hearing, what their lateral lines are telling them is around them as far as vibration, and they may go by scent. So when you're fishing out on these flats, I always scent my baits up real well, and when I'm fishing a jig or a worm or a paddle tail, I'm fishing it slow so that when these things are moving through the water, the fish, as they hear them, and they might not see them, it's going to give them a chance to track that bait. So the fish is down in the vegetation. He hears this paddle tail swim bait come by. If it's going too fast, or if it's not cast far enough to where the fish can come in and track it back to the boat, you may lose the fish. A short cast on this, the fish intercepts the bait 10 feet from the boat. That's when you see, oh, there's my bait. Oh, there's an 8-pound fish swimming behind it, and he sees the boat and he takes off. You want to throw long cast so that as you start retrieving that bait, the fish can come and track it, and when it gets that, just the right motion, maybe that paddle tail kicks or the bait drops, whatever it is, that fish is maybe a foot or two behind him, it's all over. Fish opens his mouth, big swish of the tail, and he's got that bait, and then you set on him. So these are great baits to run out there to catch the bigger fish. On any of these baits, when you throw it out, point that rod tip towards the bait, and when you get hung up, like I feel that bait hung up now, pop your reel. Just pop it through and get that bait cleaned and work it back to the boat. You don't want to start doing this stuff because you're moving that bait too far away out of the strike zone. Even when you feel vegetation out there, especially with these paddle tail swim baits, you're going to be pulling stuff up all the time. Doesn't mean you can't be productive or efficient. As that bait pops through, it's going to pop through cleanly, and it's going to still be in a position and in the state that it's not hung up with all kind of vegetation where the fish will still come up and grab it. So get out there and fish this stuff. If you happen to be in an area where you know there's a lot of fish out there, maybe the tide goes out and maybe the lake draws down or something, you can always go back to that area even though it's matted up. You're not going to be using subsurface baits. You're going to be throwing out frogs and hollow body frogs that are totally weedless that you can throw over that mat, and a lot of times those fish will come up and take them. But guys, if you've had any information that you can use and you like the video, make sure you hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed, make sure you subscribe. And until next time, I hope to see you guys out on the water. Good luck.